Hello. So Jeremy and I are going to give a short introduction each, and then we're going to follow up with a conversation after that.
And then a conversation with you guys as well, we hope.
So for the past 3 years, I've been working on a PhD in Tromsø, which is the Norse Sami word for Tromsø. It's a public sector PhD funded by the Research Council of Norway. And in practice, this means I was on research leave for 3 years from my position of curator at Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, where I've worked since 2008. It's exciting for me to talk about my project with you all here today. I submitted my dissertation in September, and if it's accepted by the committee, I will defend it in mid-January next year. So in these 10 minutes, I'd like to ground some of the underlying themes in my research, then speak about the activist group I initiated, Museer, ikke-nøytrale, as part of my project. Okay, here we go. How did I get here? What planted the seed for this research project? My project is grounded in our institution, Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum. You can see the yellow building there on the top. In our vision and strategy, anchored in the vision of our then director, Jérémie McGowan, who is here, something he terms disruptive museology. And disruptive museology, one of the core principles is institutional self-criticality as a starting point. To work towards transformation, the art museum criticizes itself from within. In addition, the methodology questions that if art museums are not responding to and getting entangled in difficult issues, then what is their purpose? How are they relevant? Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum's values are open, relevant, and co-creative. These are tools that guide me in my work. So self-criticality is a big part of my project. The idea that as a museum curator, I am part of the problem, and how do I act on my privilege? 3 case studies make up my project. And here you see the collage on the cover of my dissertation that illustrates these case studies. Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum is the main object of my research, but also includes a case study called The Feminist Killjoy Untangles Philanthropy, which investigates Nasjonalmuseets collaborative partnership with the Jon Fredriksen family. And you can see the press image up on the right. The second, unhighlighting Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum's iconic Lestadius teaching Laplanders from 1840. And you can see this painting on the bottom in the middle by François-Auguste Biard. And number 3 on top, the last show I worked on before I started my PhD, Like Betsy, an exhibition on 19th century painter Betsy Akerslot Berg. In this case study, I analyzed the interventions we performed on male monuments, like the one you can see here on Roald Amundsen. And I say male monuments because our town does not have a public monument of a named woman or an individual who is Sami. You've probably already noticed that I like hot pink. It's not only my favorite color, but it's also part of my methodology and gives me strength to do the sweaty work of going against the flow. In this theoretical work, I use verbs to indicate action, and it helps me work through my ways of being as a curator. Some of these verbs include decolonizing, hacking, killing joy, seeing, talking back, undoing, unhighlighting, and untangling. So for this presentation, I highlight what I call my working verbs in my strength color, hot pink. And I see it's kind of hard to see. It's had the opposite effect here. But people often talk about a PhD being a journey. Expect the unexpected. This was definitely true in my experience. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in the second semester, and 2 weeks later, our director, Jérémie McGowan, who was also one of my supervisors, was fired by our board of trustees without warning overnight. The museum was closed, and everyone was in an unfamiliar lockdown situation. We as staff couldn't gather, no hugs, and now leadership was gone as well. I investigate big questions concerning public art museums in Norway. What is the art museum's role and function in society? Why does it exist, and for whom? How do they uphold ethical principles? How do art museums respond when confronted with criticism? Perhaps more importantly is to envision what art museums in Norway could be. What kind of institution do we expect, and who is we? Who decides what and how an art museum works? Under Jérémie McGowan's leadership, I was inspired to experiment with critical inquiry and museum exhibitions. Yet before I started this research project, I felt I lacked the theoretical background to frame the content. I did not have the critical language to put the names to the problems concerning relevant issues, nor did I have training in museology. I'm an art historian. In some cases, I did not see the problems or fully understand the critique of structural patterns. How can we, museum workers, attempt to address problems if we cannot or willingly see them? My research involves learning to see in art museum practices and undo, that is, to dispel the tendency to regard state-funded art museums in Norway as neutral institutions. In my position as outsider-insider, what is it that I aim to undo? What is there to undo in art museum practices? Arguably, to undo, one must first learn to understand systems of power and hierarchical structures. By systems of power, I mean the beliefs, practices, and cultural norms on which institutions are built and grounded. For example, class, gender, and race. My hypothesis is that state-funded art museums in Norway do not realize their potential as social agents. My evidence shows that Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum and Nasjonalmuseet need to open up in several areas, among others, academic research, co-creation with local communities, inclusivity, transparency, and revitalization. As a researcher, you are always building on previous knowledge. I am by far not the first person to say, Museer ikke-nøytrale. And in fact, in my study, many of these discussions on museums have been happening since the inception of museums. This raises an important question. Why are museums so reluctant to change? Here I picked 3 important tools in my work. On the left is Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life, from 2017. And the feminist killjoy is Ahmed's concept, and I've applied it to art museum practices. My ongoing project of becoming a feminist is indebted to her work. In the middle, Norsk ICOM and Museumsforbundet recently published a document on ethical guidelines for museums in Norway. Here, on page 13, they state, Museer ikke-nøytrale. As institutional members of ICOM, art museums are obliged to follow these guidelines, and they are helpful tools. And lastly, Robert Janes and Richard Sandel's book from 2019, Museum Activism, which they define as the understanding of museum practice shaped out of ethically informed values that intend to facilitate political, social, and environmental change in communities. They also teach us a valuable and simple question. Why do museums do what they do? Ahmed suggests that when you point out a problem, you become a problem. Therefore, the feminist task is to keep insisting on the something. That is to stay with the trouble, which comes from Donna Haraway. To keep investigating and exposing the material one finds askew. One response could be to keep this rage to myself and move on, take the easy route and comfortably go with the flow. Instead, like Sinnetagen here, I take my anger and put it to work. Grounded in the research from my dissertation is the question, how can we grow a collective that thinks of the art museum as social agent in order to develop institutions that are more relevant for artists, people in communities, and other institutions? So we launched the group with en parole I 1. mai-toget I år. Most of the photos I show here are taken by artist Ina Otsko, who you see on the bottom left. She's also co-chair of our group. I spoke with one man at the parade who joined our parole because he said we were the most colorful. Others were curious about our message and wanted to read our manifesto, which we handed out. And here is where craft and craftivism come in. We handmade templates of our logo in Norsk Sami, which is on the back of the shirt, and in Norwegian, and spray painted signs. Even kids got into it. Spray paint is fun. The parade gave us an opportunity to shout out our manifesto and speak to people about it after the parade ended. You can find our entire manifesto on the Museer ikke-nøytrale website, where you can also purchase merch. The merch is a way to start conversations with people, and it's almost like a walking exhibition. And I have a couple images of close-ups of our post signs we made. This is in Norsk Sami and in Norwegian. Yeah, thanks.
Over to me then, Charis. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Charis, and for sharing. Charis has been doing amazing things the past 3 years, as you guys can see, and it's great that she's also been getting a lot of this out in public as well. I'm going to also share some work in progress with you all, and picking up on some of these things. Charis and I obviously collaborate on a lot of things and have shared a lot of thinking and doing over the past few years. And I want to maybe, I guess we're both talking at a slightly meta level about the craft or the crafting of museums and the making of museums, but also we are both very much dedicated to craft in general. And for me, I'm a maker, I'm a woodworker and a metal worker, and I'm also a designer and all sorts of things. And for me, I guess the interesting thing, thinking back and reflecting, also for me, being the director of a museum was a craft practice for me. It was about making. It was about making museums and about making meaning. And that remains for me. And I think maybe one of our key takeaways today is sort of like we do need more craft and craft-based perspectives and things in museums, but that in itself is not enough. Like what we show in museums is part of the picture, but maybe increasingly there's the bigger picture and the bigger structures that we need to talk about and think about and try to do, depending on what platform you have, try to do the work that you can do to speculate and make change. And so I'm going to share with you this is my latest sort of thinking out loud project. So this is a punk rock museology, a first draft manifesto, or what Hubert Robert got so right or wrong in 1796. So this is some sort of thinking I've been doing that I wanted to just sort of speak through out loud with you guys to push it a bit further today. And it sort of circulates around this amazing image, I think, that is at the Louvre in Paris, painted by Hubert. And it's this amazing image of the grand gallery of the Louvre in ruins. So it's a speculation. And he, as an artist, he was also centrally involved in making the new Louvre at that time as a curator. And that he speculated the Louvre's own demise, a sort of apocalyptic future in which, if you look at the image, there's like a woman and a kid like cooking with we could imagine that as like a trash can fire of homeless streets of New York, all sorts of amazing things happening in this image. And the sort of the power of a maker voice central, like, because we might think of things like the Louvre being like the art museum now today. And, this painting hangs there and basically never changes position for decades. But the person behind this image was also behind that original museum and the idea of making a museum and also speculating its own future sort of non-existence or state of ruin. And I find that really quite amazing as a metaphor or a way for thinking through that museums are not monuments to non-change, and they are not fixed. They can be flexible and ephemeral and all these things. So that's what I really like about this image. And then what I think is slightly more suspect, so what I think he got right in 1796 and wrong, is if we zoom in to sort of the message, the allegorical message of this image. And that is within this scene of apocalypse and ruin, the young male painter is found in the ruins. And there he is studying the classical. And the classical statue is pointing the way back to the classical architecture. So it's an amazing image of ruin and possible renewal, but then it retrieves and recuperates again the Western tradition and the classical as the core of the museum, of the art museum, and the core of art. And to me, this is then what he got horribly wrong, and what I would like to think about. And what happens when we imagine, like, our National Museum in ruins, and what do we reinsert at the center? Is it still Edvard Munch's Scream? Or what might the thing that constantly gets reinserted at the center of Norwegian art history, what is that object? And I think we all know what that painting might be. There's probably a few things we could choose from. And I think that's a very powerful tool for thinking, because we indeed do have now a National Gallery in ruins in our neighboring city. I'll speak from a Drammen perspective. So we have a sort of Hubert Robert grand gallery of the Louvre in ruins, also here in a Norwegian Nordic context. We have this ghost town National Gallery with its steel wires hanging, its post-it notes, its labels for the works that hang there, and the sun-bleached walls. We can literally see what was there and what is not there anymore. And we have this space of potential that I'm using now in a fictive, designery way to sort of think through and speculate what could possibly be there instead, and to not reinsert Munch or, I don't know, who else could we put in there? Tiedemann and these. What happens if we reinsert other things? What happens if we reinsert craft? And in this particular case, because of the affinity I have and what I've been working with primarily in the Nordic context, when we rethink and we insert dolce, for example, in these blank walls and blank spaces, both as a sort of conceptual proposition, but this is also a quite direct and realistic and concrete proposition for change. And speculating these things in the abandoned ghost town of the National Gallery, of course, raises questions about our new squeaky clean and shiny National Museum on the waterfront, because what has been put at the core there? Like, room number 1 at our new National Museum is the image of the Louvre in ruins. It's things from antiquity. Room number 1 in the National Museum. When you come in the doors and you go into the first room, it has the number 1, and number 1 is busts and fragments from antiquity. And that's for me, a mind-boggling thing, because why are we persisting in this version of understanding creative practice in the North, in the Nordics? Why do we have that Genesis story, right? Because stories are important. The stories we tell and the way we think have importance. What gets shown, what does not shown, what we insert into that core. So if we strip the museum bare and imagine it as a pillaged and plundered, ruined place, what was it that remained at the core, right? And I think that's a very powerful thing. And I think that's where I would very much promote an understanding of inserting craft at that core. And I think that's the big issue that many of our art museums aren't quite getting their head around. And I think that's an interesting thing to speak to also broader histories and broader traditions in terms of the relationship between art, society and meaning making and a sort of communal understanding of things. So that has also, like, thinking in this way, of course, creates other ways of thinking. And this is a sort of like back to the future past thing, because this was the National Museum's logo. Now they have a new logo that makes their actual name less hard. It's just NOM, and what can we do with that? But this was like easier. This was an easier thing to hack back in 2018 when I hacked it, because what happens, because they're still called the Nasjonalmuseet for Kunst, Arkitektur and Design, you know, but what happens when it's reimagined as this, or if the word craft comes in here or something else, right? Because this makes change and makes us think differently about our museums and what they are for and what they represent. So it's a similar thing, because this projects outwards as well. This sort of fictional space I try to craft in, yes, a sort of critical, tongue-in-cheek way, but also in an attempt to make change, because there are all sorts of flows of power and privilege and financing at play here, of course, in terms of where craft ends up and how we understand it and don't, and what that means for our present and our future. So this is my last speculation here. You know, what happens to our consciousness when our new Oslo skyline, you know, gets reimagined in different ways? And what could that mean for our, you know, understanding of self? This could, you know, I'll do another version for you guys that says craft on the building as well. And we'll see what that would look like and what that might make us think of. So that's my current thinking about craft and the making of museums and the making of meaning. So now we're going to have a little chat, Charis and I, and together with you guys. So I'll go to this slide and we'll have that up behind us. All right. And what do you guys think we should do? Because we all got started a little bit late. Should we stick exactly to the schedule, or should we go a little over, or something like that? We have a little bit of slack in the schedule? Okay, great. Because we don't need to talk so much. We're such a small group, it feels slightly artificial to talk too much, and we sort of said our bit, so we can involve you guys. But I think, and we want to highlight Charis here because she's been doing great work. So I'm going to ask questions so Charis can speak about her amazing things that she's been doing. But yeah, so Charis, tell us, like, you know, you've done this amazing work and thinking, and what are you like setting your sights on now in terms of possible practices, or how do you take this back to the museum and start making change in the ways that you want to see around these making ideas?
Yeah, because it's a good question. It's now is when the work begins, I'd say. Like, how do you play out this work in practice? And there's always this sort of artificial divide between theory and practice, and I think that's why I use these verbs, because as a practitioner, we're always doing things and making things, and then in the academic setting, it's very theoretical, and it becomes less of like, how does this play out in an exhibition? And so now I'm also wondering how to incorporate like Museer, ikke-nøytrale into an exhibition. How is it part of the curatorial concept? How does it play out in the museum or outside of the museum? Does it have to be in the walls of the building, or can we go out in communities?
Yeah. Wow. And then in terms of, like, I mean, we've had these discussions as well. We speak together often, but this idea as well about, you know, yeah, this privileging of objects. I mean, even the whole idea of maybe what we're displaying and what we're showing. I mean, what's your relationship to this sort of, you know, the very idea of the art museum as a place where you come and to look at things, often very sort of reified objects. How are you thinking around that these days? Because
now I'm thinking more of actually the people and focusing more on the relationships you build through the exhibition and interaction with the visitors, rather than like just focusing on the objects themselves. And how do we use these objects to activate and foster those relationships? But also, how are they relevant for people? Like, why would you come to see these specific objects? What's in it for you looking at these things?
Yeah, so you have a sort of a move away maybe from the object to a sort of increased focus on relations. And I mean, because that becomes interesting as well, because we tend to think about, and it was very interesting during the corona pandemic, I thought that the government's main idea of sort of supporting the arts and supporting museums was funding for buying things, which was really increasing this sort of object value of things, and not then making millions available for relational projects, which, I mean, it's great that artists get some of their work bought, but it would be even greater for artists if they got paid for 2 years to work on projects and develop things with communities and museums. So I thought that was also something that got revealed a bit, this sort of really entrenched ideas of how our cultural institutions work, which, money in capitalist societies is a giant litmus test of what's pulling the strings. So I don't know if you had any thoughts around those, because you were involved. There was a lot of new work getting bought in a sort of slightly bizarre vacuum of thinking.
Yeah, and it was supposed to happen really fast. The money was supposed to go back to the artist as quickly as possible, and that's not normally how you acquire and how you work with collecting objects. It was kind of you call an artist, do you have anything available right now? And this idea of how are museums collecting, because it's not sustainable. We already don't have enough room to show what we have, and it's, again, this idea of supporting capitalism and just amassing objects. But I think people also missed interactions with each other. We didn't have the exhibitions. You couldn't meet each other through programming. And so I think people missed having those connections, instead of, obviously people want to see the objects, but they also missed social interaction with people in the museum.
Yeah, so sort of meeting and the interrelational matters. I want to, get you to speak a bit to these, because it's okay, maybe we have this common ground about, museums. Well, yeah, we believe in museums. We still believe in them. We are optimistic, and we want museums to be great. And there are, and I think you rightly so pointed, maybe some of our art museums in Norway are more conflicted than others. I mean, there has been very interesting work going on, as it was said in the introduction here. Here, there's been nice visions and leadership and ideas about these things being mixed together that we would really like to see more of. So just so that's noted, that there's been very good things happening. It's maybe where the seats of power are that we have some of these issues most entrenched, because we have that, in a sense, the interesting case which you've engaged with our national museum, our new national museum, which is a new building, but to what degree is it a new institution, or was there a missed potentiality here? And you've done this work on we don't need to talk too much about the Fredriksons, but I guess if you what are the issues there for you, right? Because we have these debates. Some people say, oh, well, we need money in museums. Who cares, right? So why do you care?
For me, I mean, when I saw the press images, the one I showed in my first slide, those came out in the middle of June 2019, and I couldn't believe it. I looked at them and I thought I was dreaming or something. And the museum is saying at the same time, this will increase representation and diversity in our museum. And I'm looking at the images and I thought, that's really not what I'm reading here. It was such a mixed message, or there was something that didn't make sense. And again, it was, as part of my project, it's trying to figure out what was it about those images that really disgusted me. Why did I react that way? So digging into it, and I think that looking at the bigger picture, because the idea of this feminist killjoy is that you're exposing patriarchal norms. So the museum was trying to sell it as something good, and I didn't see it as good. So why was that? That was kind of my starting point. And at the same time, the museum was closed. So you didn't really know, how is this going to play out in practice? So there were a lot of people that saw those images and didn't really take it seriously. But I thought, museums have to take things seriously. Our job is representation. And so you can't show images like that not question them, or yeah. And I was just surprised that there wasn't like a communication strategy in place. Like when I contacted them, it was like, oh yeah, we needed good images and we're proud of this. And there was nothing, they weren't hiding anything. And I was just like blown away.
Yeah.
And then I think like, you know, the idea was when the new museum opens, we'll see these wonderful objects that they have access to through this collaborative partnership. And then maybe people will forget like the lesser pretty aspects of that agreement.
Yeah, because I was struck maybe when maybe this idea, these ideas I'm thinking about you know, the museum in ruins and the shell and the core and these type of things. It's sort of like, you know, if you're not changing the big issues in terms of your alliances with power and flows of capital and all sorts of things, you know, because there is this potential of craft that we have both worked with and believe in, and craftivist potentiality in these things. And then there's also, on the other hand, because I know you engage with this in your PhD work with museum theory, there's also this idea of the resistant museum. So the resistant museum being the thing that, you know, is very clever at changing and updating its rhetoric. So it can talk about democracy and inclusion and participation and liberation and all the buzzwords. And we've in fact had these in the museum sector in Norway already, what was it, 2008? And then the new like museumsmelding is chock full of these promising buzzwords. And then there's maybe this question, it's like, so there's an understanding of this like craftivist terminology, and we might feel that, oh great, it's happening. And then I worry sometimes, but is it, and it's Carol Duncan that writes about this, the new museology. Is it just is it the resistant museum finding new ways to reassert its privilege and its power without actually changing very much at all? So it's just rhetorics, right? And I think that's maybe something that your work is very good and necessary to sort of bring up these issues about, you know, rhetoric and a change of rhetoric versus an actual change of practice and content. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and then maybe being willing or not being willing to have these sort of thorny debates or difficult conversations, because I think that was one of the things I thought was interesting with the case study I did on National Museum or even the case study of Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, where I looked at the Lestadius painting, is how the museum reacts when it receives this criticism. Do we actually like engage with the criticism and try to maybe alter our course institutionally, or do we like shut down the criticism and try to, you know, just defend what we're doing, and oh, you guys don't know what you're talking about, so like this is the way we're doing it, of course. That's what I think is really the interesting part, because if the institution is going to have trust in society, I think it has to be willing to engage with the criticism and see that there's a potential, like it's good to have this criticism to actually like moving forward.